The morning after our divorce, I woke up to silence the kind that feels wrong in a house that held 18 years of breathing beside me. I walked into the kitchen and saw his wedding ring lying in the center of the table. Perfectly clean, perfectly still. He never took it off. Not for surgery. Not for work. Not even the night we buried his father. I checked the locks. Still bolted from inside. Then my phone lit up 7 missed calls from the hospital, all between 2:17 and 2:26 a.m., the exact time I had blocked his number and poured myself a drink to celebrate freedom. The nurse asked me one question. "Why didn't you come?" He kept asking for his wife. I remember whispering back, "I'm not his wife anymore." There was a long pause. Then she said, "He died 6 minutes after you left the courthouse. So tell me, why was his ring on my table?" If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. I woke up to a silence that didn't belong to the house anymore. 18 years leaves behind sounds you stop noticing, a drawer closing softer than mine, the kettle turned off before it screams, his steps pausing outside the bedroom door before coming in. That morning there was none of it, just air. I walked into the kitchen and stopped. His wedding ring lay in the center of the table. Not near the sink, not beside the keys, placed carefully where a person would see it immediately. Morning light from the window hit the gold and pushed a thin reflection across the wood, straight toward my hands. I didn't touch it at first. My fingers hovered above it like the surface might burn. He never took it off. Not the day he split his knuckle open fixing the fence. I had watched the doctor stitch around the metal because he refused to remove it. Not during the winter his hands swelled so badly the skin pressed against the band and left a pale groove when the swelling went down. Not even at his father's funeral, when he twisted it constantly but never slid it free. I picked it up. Cold. Not the cool of a room left overnight, the kind of cold metal keeps when it hasn't been on skin for hours. I turned it over. The inside engraving faced me, the letters worn from years of soap and dishes and work. Still us. I swallowed and looked at the front door. Locked, deadbolt still in place. Chain hanging exactly where I left it when I came home from the courthouse, dropped my heels beside the wall, and poured a drink I didn't finish. "You forgot this," I said to the empty room, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. I checked the windows. All latched. The back door still stiff from the swollen frame we never fixed. No sign anyone had been inside except the ring sitting where I could not miss it. My phone buzzed softly on the counter as I passed it. A notification from the security app I rarely opened. Movement detected. I frowned and tapped it open. Twee veertien ochtends front door camera. The thumbnail showed a figure standing on the porch beneath the weak yellow bulb. Shoulders I recognized before my mind allowed the thought. I pressed play. He stood there, just outside the door, wearing the same jacket he'd worn to court. His hair damp like he'd been walking a long time. He didn't knock. He just stood. One hand rested flat against the door exactly where my chest would be if I were leaning on the other side. The way he used to after late shifts, waiting for me to notice before coming in. "Come inside," I whispered to the screen, already knowing he wouldn't. He stayed there almost a minute, maybe more. The timestamp crept forward while nothing changed except the small movements of his breathing. Then he shifted, his shoulders tightening, his hand sliding down the wood slowly. He bent slightly. Another second. His other hand came to his chest. I felt my own lungs forget how to move. He leaned against the frame, tried to straighten, failed, and dropped out of the camera's view. The recording kept going. The porch empty, the light buzzing faintly. No one else came. No car passed. No neighbor door opened. Just nothing. My phone slipped in my grip and hit the floor, the sound loud in the quiet house. I stared at the door across the kitchen, solid, locked, unchanged, and suddenly the ring in my hand felt heavier than metal. The porch stayed empty on the screen long after he fell out of view, and I didn't move, just kept waiting for him to stand up, steady himself, and knock twice the way he used to when he forgot his keys, but he never did. I rewound the footage, and there he was again, beneath the porch light, jacket damp, shoulders tight, his hand resting flat against the door, not pounding, not urgent, just there, like he was measuring the wood between us. He still had a key. I never asked for it back at the courthouse because I was too focused on not looking at him when the judge said it was final. On the screen, his fingers curled slightly before sliding down the door, slow and controlled. Then he bent just a little, as if trying not to make it obvious, his mouth opening while his chest lagged behind each breath. And then his knees gave, not dramatic, not violent, just gravity, and he disappeared below the frame while the camera kept recording the hum of the porch light and a thin line of water running toward the step. At 2:16, a car passed at the end of the street and headlights swept across the lower corner of the image. At 2:17, the beam caught something on the ground, a sleeve. Still, I paused the video, and the timestamp read 2:17 a.m., and before I even looked, I knew what I would find. So I opened my phone log and saw 7 missed calls, all between 2:17 and 2:26, an unknown number, my thumb hovering before pressing voicemail. Static came first, then a woman's voice, clipped and steady. "Ma'am, this is Street. Andrew's emergency. We're calling regarding your husband. Please return this call immediately. Husband." The second message followed seconds later. "We have him en route. We need consent information." En route meant someone had called 911. I rewound again and watched the moment the headlights crossed the porch. The vehicle slowed for half a second, and the brake lights glowed at the far edge of the frame. Someone had seen him. The third message was quieter, background noise sharper, wheels and metal doors behind her voice. "He's asking for you." I leaned back against the counter, the tile cold against my spine, remembering how at 2:05 a.m., I had blocked his number while watching the screen confirm it, telling myself I was done responding to last-minute apologies. At 2:14, he stood outside this door. At 2:17, a stranger found him on my porch. I unlocked the door and stepped outside into thin, damp morning air. The wood beneath my feet, ordinary except for a faint scuff near the frame, a streak in the paint where something heavy had slid down, and I crouched and pressed my fingers against it, dry now but real. He hadn't tried the handle, hadn't shouted my name, had stood there long enough to remove his ring, and when I replayed the exact second before he bent his left hand, moved across his body not to steady himself but to his right hand, and when he fell, his fingers were bare. I looked down at the ring, still clutched in my palm. He didn't forget it. He left it, and he chose to do it before he hit the ground. I stood there on the porch longer than I meant to, the ring pressing into my palm until the edge left a faint mark in my skin, and for a moment I watched the street the way he used to after dinner, like something might arrive if you just waited long enough. The air had that early morning dampness that settles into the wood, and the railing smelled faintly of rain, and I realized my hand was resting in the exact spot where his had been in the footage. I pulled it back, went inside, and this time I closed the door without locking it, leaving the chain hanging loose as if I might need to open it again quickly. The kitchen felt unchanged, his mug in the drying rack, the chair slightly angled from where he used to sit, and I set the ring down beside the sink before washing my hands longer than necessary, just to steady them. My phone lay on the counter, the unknown number still at the top of the screen, and I stared at it until the display dimmed, then brightened again when I touched it. I pressed call before I could think about why. A woman answered on the third ring and spoke my name before I offered it, her tone calm but already certain. She asked if I could come in, and the way she said it made the question sound like an instruction. I asked what had happened and heard papers shift on her end before she replied that he had collapsed outside a residence and was transported at approximately 2:25 a.m., and I pictured the headlights from the video pausing at the curb, a stranger stepping out into the quiet and finding him where I hadn't opened the door. She asked me to confirm his date of birth, and I did automatically, the numbers coming out without effort, though halfway through, I remembered the last birthday cake I baked and how he barely ate any because sweets made his chest feel tight, and I told him he worried too much. There was a brief silence after I finished, and then she said he had repeatedly asked for his wife to be contacted. I told her we were divorced, and the words sounded formal, like they belonged in paperwork instead of a conversation, but she didn't acknowledge the distinction, only asked how soon I could arrive. I asked if he was awake, and she said he had been attempting to speak during transport, past tense, and the background noise sharpened behind her voice doors, movement, the low rhythm of equipment, and I thought of the second voicemail asking for consent information, a phrase that now seemed heavier than anything said in court. I glanced toward the hallway, where my bag still sat on the chair with the folded documents inside, and realized the last sentence I'd spoken to him in person was that I didn't want to be responsible for him anymore. The nurse remained quiet on the line long enough that I understood she was waiting for my answer, and I asked what he said. She hesitated, then replied, "He kept asking if you were free now." For a moment the sentence didn't make sense, then it settled into the shape he must have meant not free tonight, not free to talk, but free the way the judge had declared less than an hour before he stood outside my door. I leaned against the counter, looking at the ring beside the sink and the open doorway beyond it, and pictured him trying to form words while someone held oxygen near his face, dialing a number that would go nowhere because I had already decided I was finished hearing it. She gave me the hospital address, even though I already knew it, and added quietly that I should come now. I said yes, still staring at the same spot on the floor where my keys had fallen the night before, understanding finally the order of things. He came after the divorce, he removed the ring before he fell, and when they asked who to call, he chose the person who had chosen not to answer. I picked up my keys but didn't leave immediately, standing in the doorway for a second as the house settled into its morning quiet, then finally stepped out and drove with both hands fixed on the wheel, noticing how every red light seemed longer than usual, and how I kept glancing at the passenger seat as if expecting him to say something about my driving like he used to on early appointments. I once called unnecessary. The streets were still pale with dawn when I reached Street Andrews and parked without remembering the turns I took, the automatic doors opening to the same sterile air and burnt coffee smell I associated with waiting rooms and paperwork. And at the desk I gave his name and was directed down a hallway instead of handed forms, which told me they had already decided who I was before I spoke. A nurse met me near the station and asked me to confirm our relationship. I said we were divorced, and the word sounded smaller here, less official than it had under the judge's voice, but she only nodded and led me into a consultation room rather than a patient area, a table and 2 chairs and a monitor already open, as if the conversation had been waiting for me to arrive. She turned the screen slightly and scrolled through his record, and I expected dates from the last few weeks, maybe a recent visit he hadn't mentioned. But the appointments stretched backward, month after month, cardiology, imaging, follow-ups, overlapping ordinary days. I remembered arguing about groceries or him coming home tired. I said there must be a mistake because he never told me he was being treated, and she replied gently that he had listed me as his medical proxy and had chosen not to involve me unless necessary, and the word proxy felt heavier than anything she had said so far. I kept reading until the diagnosis line held still in front of me. Progressive heart failure, documented nearly a year ago. I thought about the nights he sat on the edge of the bed, pressing his hand to his chest, and how often I said, "Stress did that to people," how easily he agreed. I asked why surgery hadn't been done, and she opened another tab labeled Consent, explaining that because I was listed as decision maker, they required confirmation before proceeding, and a digital form appeared with a signature at the bottom that looked familiar before I admitted why. The date matched the afternoon at the courthouse. I said I never signed anything medical, only the divorce papers and a stack of routine documents. The attorney slid toward me, and she read quietly from the header, "Refusal of surgical intervention acknowledged by proxy." The room felt smaller, the vent louder, and I tried to reconstruct the moment, the pen moving because I wanted it finished, the headings I didn't read once I recognized our names. She told me the document had been delivered by his legal representative that same day, and I couldn't place when exactly between leaving the courtroom and finding the ring on my table that decision had become real. I looked back at the diagnosis, at months of visits that ran parallel to arguments I thought were about distance, and asked whether he knew the condition was serious. She said he understood the risks and insisted on handling the timing himself, and I noticed she avoided saying why. The silence between us stretched long enough that I realized the calls asking for consent hadn't been random paperwork but connected to a choice already made, though I still didn't know by whom. I finally asked who found him outside the house, and she checked the notes before answering that a passing driver had called emergency services after seeing him collapse near the door, then added that during transport he kept trying to speak but would only repeat one request. I didn't ask what it was this time because I already knew, and I stared at the signature again, understanding only one part. Clearly whatever happened between the courthouse and my front door had started long before either of us said goodbye. I kept staring at the screen even after the nurse stopped speaking, my name sitting beneath the words refusal of surgical intervention, and the longer I looked, the less it felt like something I had done and more like something that had happened while I was focused somewhere else. I said there must be a mistake, that I never declined treatment, and she explained carefully that the surgical team required acknowledgement from the listed proxy before scheduling because post-operative decisions might depend on it. Not that I personally rejected the procedure, only that without confirmation they could not proceed. The distinction sounded small, but it held the same weight in practice, and she scrolled to a cardiology note dated 6 weeks earlier outlining options and survival projections, numbers arranged in neat columns that should have frightened someone who understood them. I remembered that week only as the one where we argued about how quickly the divorce could be finalized, how I insisted delays would only make things worse, and how he said very little except that he was tired. I asked when he learned surgery was recommended, and she pointed to an earlier consultation almost 2 months back. Then, to a series of follow-ups that matched evenings, he came home later than usual and went straight to the bedroom instead of sitting with me in the living room. I had assumed avoidance. Now the dates suggested appointments. The nurse added that he had chosen limited notification, meaning they would contact me only when legally necessary, and I pictured the paperwork on his desk weeks ago, the envelopes I thought were financial statements, the way he closed the folder when I entered the room as if it were about us rather than about him. I leaned forward, tracing the timestamp on the consent form with my finger without touching the screen, and saw it had been uploaded the same afternoon I left the courthouse. I could almost feel the pen again, moving from tab to tab because I wanted everything finished, the attorney explaining timelines while I listened only for the word final. When was surgery meant to happen? I asked. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from, and what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. Once acknowledgement was received, she replied. He asked for minimal delay. Minimal delay. The phrase lingered while I looked at the medication list beneath it. Prescriptions filled on days I had stayed with my sister after arguments. Days I told him distance might help clarity. He must have driven himself to those visits, sat in rooms like this one hearing percentages without bringing them home. I asked whether he seemed afraid, and she said he was precise rather than emotional, concerned mostly with timing and documentation, timing the same urgency I thought belonged only to ending our marriage. I asked if the window was still open, and she said the cardiologist would reassess after stabilization, but the margin was smaller now, which sounded less like medical terminology and more like a clock moving forward regardless of conversation. I pushed my chair back slightly and stood, needing the movement, and for a moment watched staff pass in the hallway through the glass panel, each person continuing a routine that had nothing to do with what I was reading. I thought about the calls I hadn't answered and how they must have come when the hospital needed confirmation to move ahead, not knowing the number was blocked. The nurse remained quiet, letting me look, until I asked the question that had been forming since I saw the timeline. Did he intend to have the surgery? She checked the note again before answering that he planned to proceed once certain arrangements were completed. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask her to, because I didn't yet know what those arrangements were, only that they overlapped the hours between the courthouse and my front door, and that whatever he had been preparing had required the legal distance I insisted on before he tried to reach me one last time. I remained in the hallway a moment longer after the nurse finished, watching staff pass behind the glass panel before asking who had delivered the consent paperwork because I didn't remember any hospital requesting my decision directly. She checked the entry and said it arrived from his legal representative earlier that afternoon, and the detail caught strangely against my memory of the courthouse office, where stacks of documents moved across the table faster than I wanted to follow them. I stepped out toward the vending machines, the hum filling the silence, and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the attorney's number and calling before I had time to decide whether I should wait. His assistant answered and sounded surprised to hear from me so early, saying he wasn't in yet, and I told her it concerned documents submitted to a hospital under his authorization. The brief pause that followed was enough to make me stay on the line until she transferred the call. He answered after 2 rings, voice composed in the way people speak when they already understand the topic, and I asked why a medical refusal form with my signature had been sent from his office the same day as the divorce filing. He asked if I was at the hospital, and when I said yes, He exhaled quietly before explaining the document had been part of a notarized medical directive provided by his client and included among legal filings he was instructed to process. Once the decree was entered, I told him I never knowingly authorized medical decisions, and he replied that the directive identified me as proxy and required acknowledgement, which he believed I had reviewed because the pages were presented directly for signature in person. I tried to remember whether he had explained each section and realized he had only indicated where signatures were needed, not what each paragraph meant. I asked if my ex-husband understood the effect of the directive, and the attorney answered carefully that his client had been fully informed and wished the matter handled without complication, his wording deliberate enough that I noticed he never used a personal name. When I asked why the hospital received it before nightfall, he paused briefly and said the paperwork had been prepared in advance pending final judgment, adding he could not discuss private consultation details, but that timing had been important to his client. Important how? I asked, and he replied only that his client wanted confirmation the documents were filed before leaving the courthouse area. I leaned against the wall, the vibration of the vending machine faint through my shoulder, and asked whether there had been urgency beyond the divorce itself. The attorney hesitated and then said quietly that his client had organized several matters around a single evening and wanted no legal uncertainty afterward. He didn't elaborate and I didn't press, because the explanation sat somewhere between ordinary preparation and something I couldn't yet define. I thanked him and ended the call, holding the phone in my hand a moment longer before lowering it, aware only that the paperwork I had signed that afternoon had carried more weight than I understood, and that whatever he intended to do later that night, he had arranged it long before I reached the hospital. I stayed by the vending machine for a moment after ending the call, the faint vibration still against my shoulder, and realized I was holding my phone without knowing what I meant to do next, until the screen dimmed and reflected my face back at me. I opened the banking app almost automatically, not expecting anything specific, just reaching for the last part of our lives that had always followed rules, and the joint account still appeared in my saved list, even though I hadn't checked it since the separation. I entered the password I hadn't changed yet and waited for the balance to load, assuming it would show the same numbers we had argued over weeks ago, but the total appeared as 0. I refreshed once, then again, before opening the transaction history and seeing a series of transfers made late the previous afternoon, each time stamped within minutes of the final court filing. The destination account carried my name, not the shared account, but the personal one I opened years earlier for freelance payments, the one he rarely used and never questioned. I switched apps and opened it, and the balance there had increased by an amount that took a moment to process because it represented the liquid savings and brokerage funds we had accumulated over years, moved quietly from one place to another without any note attached. I leaned back against the wall and scrolled through the entries, the timing too precise to be accidental. Decree entered, funds moved, confirmations logged. I remembered the last conversation about finances, how I insisted we separate everything cleanly, and he agreed without discussion, which I had taken as indifference. Now it looked closer to preparation, though I still couldn't tell preparation for what. I returned to the consultation room and sat down again, the chart still open on the monitor, and asked the nurse whether he had provided insurance information during admission. She checked and said he listed minimal coverage and requested billing communication be directed to the contact on file me. And when I asked whether extended cardiac treatment could create personal liability, she answered, carefully, that without strong coverage, significant expenses were possible, depending on outcome. The explanation was routine, but it aligned with the numbers on my phone in a way I hadn't expected. I looked again at the transfer confirmations and thought about how easily he accepted every financial term in the divorce, never asking for appraisal or mediation, never questioning the house even though it carried most of the value. At the time, I told friends he wanted distance as much as I did. Now I noticed the order. Legal matters settled first, accounts cleared next, and only then the night itself. Did he ask about billing? I said. She nodded slightly and replied that he confirmed who would be responsible after admission, and I pictured him answering practical questions while paramedics worked around him, choosing clarity over explanation. The final transaction occurred minutes before the timestamp from my door camera, and whatever it meant, it wasn't accidental. The money now sat in my name, quiet and unmoving, and I closed the app because looking at it felt less like security and more like something he intended me to notice later. I kept the phone in my hand even after the screen dimmed, the overhead lights sliding across the glass while I tried to understand what the transfers were meant to resolve. Because money explained practical things, but not the photograph that had ended everything. I hadn't opened it since the hearing, only remembered the moment it appeared 2 days before court, his face turned toward a woman I didn't know, her hand resting against his arm in a way that erased years faster than any argument, and the certainty I felt then had outweighed anything he said afterward. I searched my email and found the message again, still unread because I never needed to open it after seeing the preview, and this time I tapped it. The image filled the screen more clearly than I recalled, taken from a distance across a parking lot at dusk, and details stood out I hadn't noticed before. The building sign behind them, partially visible but recognizable as the outpatient wing of this hospital, the woman wearing a badge clipped near her shoulder, his body angled slightly away as if mid-step rather than turned toward her. Beneath the photo, the sender showed a string of random characters, and when I expanded the header, the routing information displayed only a general origin, a residential network in the same neighborhood as my sister's street. I paused there, unsure whether coincidence was possible, but the timestamp matched the evening she visited, the night she insisted I shouldn't ignore what was obvious and asked if I had checked my email yet. I scrolled through our messages from that hour and saw her questions again, spaced minutes apart, pushing for a decision I thought came from concern. I studied the badge in the photo and turned the phone toward the nurse, asking if she recognized the logo. She leaned closer and said it resembled cardiology outpatient staff, though she couldn't be certain from the image alone. The answer didn't explain the message, but it altered the moment, captured less private meeting, more clinical encounter interrupted mid-motion. I lowered the phone and replayed the sequence in my mind. Her visit, the email arriving shortly after, my reaction immediate and final. I opened the header once more and hovered over my sister's contact without calling, the quiet of the room settling differently now, not clearer but rearranged. The timestamp on the image aligned with one of his documented appointments, and whatever the photograph showed, it had reached me before any explanation could follow. I kept my thumb over my sister's name longer than I meant to, watching the call icon pulse faintly before pressing it, and she answered on the second ring with the same brightness she used every morning, asking if everything was finalized yet. For a moment I almost followed the answer she expected, but instead I asked where she was 2 nights before the hearing. There was a pause, small but noticeable, and she said she'd been out running errands, asking why, and I told her I opened the email again. The line stayed quiet a second longer than conversation usually allows before she said she knew it must have been hard to see and that she worried I wouldn't believe it otherwise. I asked how she received it first, and she said a friend sent it and she only forwarded it so I wouldn't walk into court unaware. I told her the header showed it came from a residential connection in her neighborhood. Another pause followed, longer this time, and the brightness in her voice settled into something flatter as she said technical details didn't change what the picture showed. I described the badge in the photo and the hospital sign behind them and asked whether she knew he had appointments there, but she didn't answer directly, instead repeating that he'd been distant and that I deserved clarity before signing anything permanent. I asked if she took the photo herself. The question lingered long enough that I could hear my own breathing in the receiver before she exhaled and said she hadn't meant to complicate things, only make them clear. She explained she'd been waiting in the hospital lobby for someone and saw him crossing the parking lot with a woman, and when I didn't respond, she spoke faster, saying she thought I needed proof because I always defended him. I asked why she didn't speak to him then, and she said she didn't want him explaining it away before I could decide what it meant. I told her the woman appeared to work in cardiology and that the timestamp matched one of his appointments, and she went quiet again before saying she didn't know that at the time, only that it looked like something I should see. I asked why she kept asking if I had checked my email that night, and she replied she knew I might hesitate otherwise and the hearing was close. Her voice softened as she added she didn't want me tied to someone who wasn't choosing me first. I watched the reflection of the ceiling lights shift across the floor while she spoke, thinking about how he never argued when I confronted him, how he only said the timing was wrong, and I asked if she ever told him she'd seen the photo. She said no because she didn't want to alert him before I decided what to do. The words settled heavier than the explanation itself before I decided, and I realized she never expected a conversation between us to change anything. I would have talked to him, I said. You would have forgiven him, she answered immediately. I didn't argue, only told her the hospital believed it was a medical visit, not a meeting, and she replied quietly that appearances matter once trust shifts. I ended the call without raising my voice, holding the phone loosely while the connection tone faded, aware only that the photograph arrived at exactly the moment it would have the strongest effect, and that he never once tried to prove it false. I remained seated after the call ended, the phone still warm in my hand, and for the first time since walking into the hospital, I felt something heavier than anger settle into the room. He never tried to prove it false. The thought repeated while I looked at the cardiology notes on the monitor, the appointment dates aligning with the image, and I realized I had never actually asked him to explain beyond that first confrontation. I showed him the photo. He looked at it longer than I expected. He said, "The timing isn't what you think." I told him that sounded like avoidance. He didn't argue after that. I asked the nurse if he had personal belongings from admission. She nodded and returned with a clear plastic bag containing his wallet, his watch, and a folded envelope with my name written across it in his handwriting. Seeing it affected me more than the chart had. She left the room quietly, and I opened the seal, taking the envelope first. The paper inside had been folded carefully, the edges softened from being handled. "If you're reading this," it began. I didn't manage to explain in person. I sat down slowly. "I didn't tell you about the diagnosis because I was afraid you would stay for the wrong reason. You've always taken responsibility seriously, sometimes more than you should, and I didn't want illness to decide your choice." I read the line again before continuing. "The woman in the parking lot works with my cardiologist. She was explaining the surgical window. When you showed me the photo, I tried to say the timing was different, but I could see you had already decided what it meant. If I pushed harder, it might have sounded like I was asking you to remain out of guilt, and I didn't want that." The sentences moved steadily, like conversations he used to have when he had already accepted an outcome. I asked my attorney to finish the paperwork the same day, so there would be fewer complications for you if something went wrong during surgery. The transfers were not a settlement. I thought it would make things simpler. My hands tightened slightly on the page. "You used to think I was passive when I stayed quiet. I wasn't always certain staying quiet was right. I just believed it might leave you freer to choose." I paused there, remembering how tired he looked when I accused him, how quickly I interpreted it as indifference. I told him I didn't want to be responsible for him anymore. He nodded once, not agreeing, just accepting, and asked what time the hearing was. The letter continued. "I planned to go to the hospital after I stopped by the house. I didn't intend to leave the ring unless you didn't answer." The line blurred before returning to focus. "If you didn't open the door, I would understand you needed distance more than explanation." I pressed the paper flat against the table, aware now of the order he tried to create separation first, decisions clearer afterward not to disappear from my life, but to keep my decision from being shaped by what might happen next. He hadn't tried to correct the photograph because doing so might have turned the conversation into obligation instead of choice. The last paragraph was shorter. "I'm not asking you to feel guilty. I only hope you won't believe you abandoned me. You made the decision you understood at the time." I folded the letter along its original crease and placed it back into the envelope, understanding the sequence differently now. The message arrived before explanation, the divorce finished before surgery, the accounts moved before admission, and the ring left only if the door stayed closed. I kept the envelope in my hands for a long time after folding the letter back along its crease, not opening it again but not putting it away either, as if the paper itself had weight. When the nurse returned and asked if I was ready to see him, I almost said no out of habit. Postponing difficult things had become easier than finishing them, but I nodded before I could think it through. She led me down the hallway, past doors partly open to morning light and the steady rhythm of monitors that sounded less dramatic than the silence I had imagined. When she opened the last door, she stepped aside and left me standing just inside. He looked smaller than he did at home, not fragile exactly, but reduced to breathing and waiting. I stopped near the foot of the bed instead of the chair, unsure what distance meant now. For a moment I didn't speak. I had replayed arguments for days, and none of them fit here. His eyes were closed, his hand resting over the blanket instead of tucked beneath it the way he slept. I noticed things I'd overlooked before: the pale line at his wrist from his watch, the gray at his temples I'd called ordinary time instead of strain. I set the envelope on the table. "I read it," I said quietly. His eyes opened slowly, and focused on me. You came. I almost didn't. He breathed in, shallow but steady. I thought, maybe understanding would be enough. It wasn't, I answered. He shifted slightly, the movement careful. I didn't explain well. I pulled the chair closer but didn't sit yet. Why didn't you try harder? He looked at me a moment before speaking. You sounded certain. I didn't want to argue you into staying. You could have told me anyway. I did a little, he said, voice thin with effort. Not enough. The room stayed quiet except for the monitor's rhythm. The money, I said. You moved it. A faint nod, in case recovery was long. And if it wasn't? He glanced toward the window. Then it would still help. I sat down finally, closer than I expected. The ring. You left it because I didn't open the door. He closed his eyes briefly before answering. I knocked once. Didn't want to keep knocking. I remembered the camera timestamp, the minutes I ignored the call. You were going to the hospital. Yes. I watched his hand against the blanket, realizing how often we filled silence with assumptions instead of questions. I thought you didn't care enough to fight. His eyes opened again. I cared enough not to force it. The words were simple, almost unfinished, but clearer than the long explanations I imagined before. I looked around the room, chair, window, morning light, and understood how quickly we had decided everything, and how little either of us checked whether quiet meant agreement or surrender. I stayed seated after his last words settled into the quiet, not reaching for his hand yet, not stepping back either. The morning light had shifted higher against the wall, softening the edges of the room, and for the first time since the divorce, I wasn't trying to win an argument inside my head. I was only listening to what remained. You don't have to stay, he said after a moment, eyes still half open, voice thinner now. I know, I answered. The sentence felt different this time. Before, it meant escape. Now it meant choice. I looked at the envelope on the table, at the crease where I had folded it back along his original line, and realized how much of our marriage had been built on quiet negotiations neither of us named. I mistook restraint for indifference. He mistook decisiveness for certainty. We both protected the other from conversations we should have had directly. I was wrong about the photo, I said. He didn't rush to respond. You reacted to what you saw. I reacted to what I feared. That earned the smallest shift in his expression, not relief, not accusation, just recognition. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to whether understanding arrived too late or exactly on time. I can't undo the divorce, I said. It's final. He nodded once. But that doesn't mean I walk away now. The words surprised me even as I spoke them. Not because they were dramatic, they weren't, but because they weren't built on guilt or obligation. They came from clarity I hadn't allowed before. He studied me for a few seconds, as if measuring whether the sentence carried weight or impulse. You don't owe me recovery, he said quietly. I'm not here because I owe you, I replied. I'm here because I didn't ask enough questions. The room held that truth without pushing back. Outside the window, the day had fully begun, hospital staff moving through routines that would continue long after ours finished. I thought about the sequence of events the photo sent before explanation, the divorce signed before surgery, the money moved before admission, the ring left only if the door stayed closed, and understood that none of it was manipulation. It was caution. We both tried to make the exit cleaner than the conversation required. I don't know what happens next, I said honestly. Neither do I, he answered. It was the first time uncertainty didn't feel like threat. I stood briefly and moved the chair closer to the bed, not dramatically, just enough that distance no longer required raising my voice. I rested my hand lightly over his, not gripping, not apologizing, simply acknowledging presence. His fingers shifted slightly in response. We're legally strangers, I said, almost to myself. He gave the faintest breath of a smile. We've been more complicated than that for years. I let that sit between us. The divorce decree would not reverse itself. The past week would not rewrite itself, but neither of us had to continue interpreting silence as verdict. I'm not promising forever, I said. I'm promising to stay through the surgery. His eyes closed briefly, not from dismissal but from relief, measured carefully. That's enough. I looked at the envelope one more time and slid it into my bag, not as evidence anymore, but as reminder. The ring was still on my kitchen table. The account still carried the funds he moved. The decree still bore both our signatures. None of those facts erased what sat quietly in this room, two people who had misread each other in the same language. The nurse knocked lightly and stepped in to check the monitor, nodding without comment. I didn't step away. For the first time since the morning after the divorce, I wasn't standing at a threshold. I was choosing to remain inside the room long enough to understand what had never been betrayal, only fear spoken too softly to be heard.